incarcerated. So I wanted to show you the growth of prisons, going all the way back to the 1920s. You can see that we had a pretty steady prison population for an extended period of time, and this is just prisons. This doesn't count the jail population, which is about 700,000. We had a pretty steady population in prisons up until the mid-1960s. We started to see a little bit of growth, and then about 1974 or so, we started seeing an explosion. Part of that was related to President Nixon's war on drugs, but it was more closely related, in my opinion, with President Johnson's war on crime, which we never hear anything about. And I'll share with you guys a little bit later, a little bit about that. So we've seen this huge growth in the prison population, and it has been a major issue for an extended period of time, and it's not going to abate anytime in the near future. So these are all the correctional institutions in the state of Wisconsin, and I created this spreadsheet to show people when we built our correctional institutions and what their design capacity was when they were built. And so you can see we've progressively gotten to the point where we can incarcerate larger numbers of people. So in the 1850s, we built Waupun, and we could incarcerate 882 people in the entire state. And as we see, we've grown by the 1890s, 1,600. By the end of the 1920s, nearly 2,300. By the end of the 1950s, 2,400. By the end of the 1960s, about 4,300. By the end of the 1970s, we had the capacity to incarcerate about a little more than 6,000 people. By the end of the 1980s, that had jumped to nearly 9,000. And by the end of the 90s, you see tremendous growth. In the 1990s, we were up to over 12,000. And then by the end of the 2000s, when we built the last correctional institution in 2004, we had the capacity of incarcerating 17,263. That's the original design capacity. However, the prisons have added on spaces to incarcerate even larger numbers of people. And currently, we are at 133% of the original design capacity of all of those prisons combined. However, we're just a little bit higher than the operating capacity. We currently have 23,655 people in prison in the state of Wisconsin, in our state prisons. So we see that we have a steady growth, but a majority of this happened really since the end of the 1970s. And a lot of it had to do with the launch of Reagan's war on drugs and the larger capacity we created to incarcerate people. So there's been a history of resistance of prisons since the first prisons were ever built. It's always been an issue for people who were incarcerated. They've never liked the conditions that they were incarcerated under, and there's always been resistance. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. Probably the first, most well-articulated resistance movement was at Folsom Prison back in 1970. The prisoners there wrote this manifesto, and they created what they called the Bill of Rights for Prisoners. And they wanted this to be something that covered not only the people where they were, but they wanted this to spread throughout the nation eventually. They felt that there were certain rights that should be extended to people who were incarcerated, and obviously they had a long list. And most of the things on the list, of course, did not happen, and they still haven't happened. But they are still working on those things in prisons around the country, as well as groups outside of the prisons who are supporting the people who are currently incarcerated to make things better. So that's a long list. This is their Bill of Rights that they created at the same time. And you know, one of the things that we never really think about or articulate are rights. You're in prison. Why should you have any rights, is what I hear people say. You committed a crime, you know, you do the crime, you do the time, nobody really cares about you. And that's kind of the mindset that America has overall for people who are incarcerated. We put people away in facilities that are typically far away from where they live, and we don't think about them anymore. We don't think about the fact that these are places that should be places that do something to help them to be better once they get out. But in many cases, it makes their lives progressively worse. Here in the state of Wisconsin, we have a large number of people who are alcohol and drug dependent. In our prison system, we have a significant number of people who have mental health issues who are in our prison. And the majority of these people are not getting the type of treatment that they need There's a long waiting list to get treatment for mental health issues as well as drug and alcohol issues. And so what ends up happening is living under those conditions within our prisons actually exacerbates the issues that people have when they come into the system. And then to place people who have mental health issues in solitary confinement is the craziest thing you can imagine. You're taking a person who obviously needs treatment, they're not getting treatment. Instead of giving them the treatment, you stick them in a box for, as long as you choose to, and then somehow you think that if that person ever gets out, that they're going to be a better person. It's never going to happen. So we really have to do a lot of changes in terms of reforming the way that we treat people once they are incarcerated. My belief here in the state of Wisconsin, one of the biggest problems we have within the system is that we send a significant number of people to prison who have not committed a crime. It's called revocation. So when you get out of prison in Wisconsin, you have a list of 18 rules that you have to live by. State mandated rules, in addition to other rules that your probation or parole agent may add to this list of 18. If you violate one of these rules, if you're simply accused of violating one of these rules, you will be held in a Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility while they do an investigation, and then they can choose to send you back to prison. Doesn't mean you committed a crime. You may have missed meetings with your probation and parole agent. You may have had a situation where you got a job without telling your probation and parole agent ahead of time. You move without telling them. I mean, if you look at the list, it's an absolutely ridiculous list. And one of the things that's on the list, now check this out. One of the rules on the list says you are mandated to attend all scheduled and unscheduled meetings with your probation and parole agent. Now, I don't have a problem with people attending the ones that are scheduled, but how are you going to tell me I have to attend ones that are unscheduled? So if I'm in the middle of work, I've been fortunate enough to find a job, and I'm in the middle of work, and then you call me, well, tomorrow you have to come and see me at 1 o'clock. Well, my job may not let me off. But if I don't go to that meeting, then it's not going to matter because I'm not going to have the job, because you're going to have the police arrest me, stick me in the MSDF, and then who knows what's going to happen after that. So it's really a system that sends over 30% of the people who go to prison each year in Wisconsin go due to revocations. Most people think that everybody that goes into the prison system, these are people convicted of crimes, but for many years, and I've looked at the data since about 2002, several of those years, we've actually sent more people to prison in Wisconsin for revocation than we have for people who got new sentences as a result of a conviction court. So that's a major, major issue. The issue of mass incarceration isn't just the fact that we have 2.2 million people incarcerated. It's that about 500,000 to 600,000 people a year get out of our prisons and jails, but we send another 500,000 or 600,000 to prison or jail each year. And that's why the number stays pretty steady. So part of what we have to do when we talk about reform is to stop sending people to incarceration unnecessarily. And it's not, I'm not a proponent of it because, well, it's going to save the state money. I could care less about the state saving money. I'm concerned with saving people's lives, because every person who's incarcerated, they come from a community where they are attached to people, friends, family members, neighbors, co-workers, whomever. And when we take people and we put them in a prison system that doesn't allow them to have contact with their family members and things of this nature on a regular basis, that breaks up relationships. It fractures families. It fractures children in particular. If you have incarcerated parents, you're much more at risk for committing a variety of different acts than you would be if you didn't have a parent who was incarcerated. So it impacts not just the people who are incarcerated, it impacts a lot of other people in our community we don't think about. So, how many of you guys have heard of George Jackson? Anybody here read Soledad Brothers? I read this many years ago when I lived in California, and I was fascinated by the story. Once I heard more about it, a friend of mine gave me the book. I'd never heard of George Jackson. I read the book, and then I heard about what happened to him, which I'll share with you. But he was first sent to prison when he was 18. He was part of a small group that robbed a gas station, got away with $72. And he was given a sentence after being convicted of 1 year to life. 1 year to life. That was the sentence. 1 year to life for stealing $72. So he ended up spending the next 11 years in prison, and 8.5 of those he was in solitary confinement. 8.5 years out of 11 in solitary confinement. Imagine what that does to a person's psyche. And so he was offered parole, and he was refused 8 separate times. So he should have had the opportunity to get out, but he never did. So when he was 28, he was charged with the murder of a guard in Soledad prison. We're going to watch a short video shortly that will tell you more about that. And then his first book came out shortly after he was indicted for that murder. And it was originally not published in the U.S. Originally it was published overseas in England, Germany, Italy, and Sweden. Eventually it was published in the United States, but at first they were like, no, we can't publish it in the U.S. Nobody would want to read it. He was killed in California San Quentin Prison August 21st, 1971, by 2 guards who fired down at him as he ran toward the wall surrounding the prison after a 30-minute takeover of solitary confinement. And that's the standard narrative about what happened to him. However, there's always been a level of distrust in the official version of what happened. So I want to show you a video which will articulate a little bit more about George Jackson.
Jackson was born in Chicago 30 years ago today. At 19, he took part in a minor robbery. With already 2 convictions, he pleaded guilty to get a lighter sentence. He got 1 year to life, a sentence in which the inmate normally does a couple of years and then is paroled if he behaves. Jackson was never paroled. He spent 10 years inside, mostly at San Quentin, mostly in solitary confinement cells like this. For 10 years, Jackson read and wrote constantly. Prison was his school. His letters were collected and published in a book. For him, the oppression and humiliation, the frustration and the violence of the prison system were but a reflection of what it was like to be a black man outside in American society. Prison made George Jackson a revolutionary. Violence he saw as the only instrument of change. Overnight, his letters made him an idol of the left and a respected literary figure.
The letters to my family, my mother, my father, sisters, my brother, John, they were intended to familiarize them with the situation I was faced with here. Of course, here in prison, we see the repression, the exploitation, the victimization of lower class people.
The violence that had been building up suddenly erupted at this prison a year last January. In a racial brawl, 3 black prisoners were shot down and killed by a white guard in a gun tower. A few days later, a white guard was murdered in retaliation. 3 black prisoners were charged with the killing. The prison was Soledad, and the accused became known as the Soledad Brothers. George Jackson was regarded as being the ringleader.
Was the incident for which you're charged now, was it a revolutionary act on your part?
You're asking me to confess to something?
Unless you want to, did you kill a man?
Look, one of the most important elements of guerrilla warfare is to maintain secrecy. I've killed nobody until it's been proven. And they'll never be able to prove anything like that.
The alarm was sounded. Jackson ran out of the block and back across the courtyard, gun in hand. The authorities say he was shot twice, in the legs and through the head. He fell here and died, making for this wall 50 yards away and 25 feet high. That's the official version of Jackson's death. It raises several questions. I saw Jackson's body shortly after the shooting. I saw more wounds than the 2 that the authorities had stated. This week, the pathologist finally published his report. Jackson, he said, was shot in the back. The bullet traveled upwards and out through the top of his head. This conflicts with the authorities' story. But yesterday, San Quentin still maintained that Jackson was shot from above, from a gun tower.
I raised my children to love people. I raised them to mingle in American society, but American society didn't want them.
You think that George's death was inevitable, given the kind of things he was saying and writing?
They couldn't let him live. It wasn't anywhere possible for them to let him live. He's a black man. They're afraid that people will begin to listen. And they had. People all over the world had begun to listen to George. And I certainly know the people in this country had. That's the reason why they framed him to be murdered the way he was. To try to discredit everything that he had said. To try to paint him as an insane maniac, an animal. That was the reason for it.
Could he be violent?
Only if people were violent to him. I can be violent also, and I imagine so can you. You see, that's the whole story of America. They take their violence and turn it back around on somebody else. I don't have to talk about American violence. You can look all over the world and see American soldiers everywhere fighting in other people's countries and killing them. So if I were running the country in America, I wouldn't open my mouth about violence. As many people as they've murdered in Vietnam in the past 10 years, and they're going to talk about violence. As many black people that get killed every day in this country and nobody knows or cares, and they will tell me about violence. How they wiped out a whole nation of Indians, and they're going to say something to me about violence. I don't want to hear it.
I like his book. So probably the most well-known prison uprising in history occurred in Attica in New York, September of 1971. And this occurred just a couple weeks after George Jackson was killed in California. And this facility was a maximum security prison in New York, and it ended the bloodiest prison confrontation in American history. 5 days before these photographs that you see are some of the victims, you'll see that 1,300 prisoners rebelled, took over the prison, and held 40 guards hostage. And they issued a list of demands, which I'll show you shortly, including calls for improvement in living conditions as well as educational and training opportunities. So they entered negotiations with the state. The governor at the time was Nelson Rockefeller, and he was planning at some point to become president of the United States of America. So he made sure that he was going to be tough on crime. When it came to the negotiations, he decided we could care less about the negotiations and ordered the prison to be basically invaded and that the guards who were being held hostage should be freed. Unfortunately, many of them were killed by the authorities when they went into the facility. And it was a tragic event, but the most tragic thing about Attica is that for many years, the truth of what happened in Attica was not available for most of us. For many years, the state of New York lied about it. They wouldn't allow anyone to see the records. We were told that the prisoners had actually killed the hostages, but we found out that that simply was not true. So here's another video to articulate exactly what happened with Attica.
Look back at a pivotal moment in this nation's criminal justice history. It's a story with themes of racial nation's criminal justice history. It's a story with themes of racial tension, mass incarceration, and policing that all echo today. And to Jeffrey Brown.
September 1971. Attica Prison in upstate New York became the site of a bloody prison clash that would shock the nation. Over several chaotic days, some 1,300 inmates seized parts of the prison and demanded better living conditions.
We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be driven or beaten as such.
In the initial takeover, a guard was killed. Inmates held about 40 prison employees as hostages, negotiating with the state of New York, and bringing in outside counsel, including attorney William Kunstler. Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused a face-to-face visit, Talks soon disintegrated, and on September 13th, hundreds of armed troopers stormed the prison to retake control.
Your instructions are, if your weapon is not to be taken, be taken.
29 inmates and 10 hostages were killed in the takeover. Scores more were injured. The story, much of it long kept hidden from view, is told in the new book, Blood in the Water, The Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and Its Legacy. Author Heather Ann Thompson is an historian at the University of Michigan. Now, you argue there are two stories to tell. One is the what happened and one is the aftermath. Start with the what happened. What did the period leading up to the riot? What was going on? What led to it?
Well, prisons in 1971, much like today, were these out of sight, out of mind places where people were treated very badly. And the guys inside worked through the system first to try to get their conditions improved. Again, very basic things, enough food to eat, sufficient sanitary supplies. And when that really fails, frustration mounts. Ultimately, they erupt in a protest. And the book tells that story. It's a remarkable story of men from very different backgrounds who stand together, negotiate with the state of New York with the help of observers.
The riots were not planned.
No, not at all. It actually begins for a quite unexpected clash between prisoners and guards that morphs into something much more organized. The guys elect representatives from the cell block to speak for them. They begin negotiating with the state for better conditions, and for 4 days the world watches as the media is there to see how this thing is going to unfold.
Also violence, though. I mean, one guard is killed early on, so
Indeed.
it is real violence, not just the specter of violence. So what happened? Days go by, and the state decides to go in. Now, why? What led to that?
Well, that was one of the questions I had. This is a prison protest that starts with a great deal of violence initially, but becomes a very peaceful and orderly protest. And yet, suddenly, in the middle of the negotiations, the state decides to retake this prison with enormous force. Nearly 600 heavily armed law enforcement personnel enter the prison. And it's a massacre. And what was remarkable was that everybody in the governor's office, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, had been told, don't do this. It is going to be a massacre. And he did anyway. And so part of my question was that, why in the midst of negotiations did we end this with such violence?
And what do you conclude?
Well, I think the short answer is that Nelson Rockefeller was very interested in his own political aspirations. He wanted to be the president. He was moving rightward as his party. The Republican Party was moving rightward. This is the early 70s. This is Nixon's in the White House. And really, Attica becomes this line in the sand. It's this moment where he's going to be tough on crime.
The politics of law and order.
Indeed, and therefore this story, this civil rights story, this human rights story, it's a pivot moment in American history where we go from a civil rights era discussing prison reform to a very, very punitive era that we then become, the country with the most prisons in the world.
The second part of the story, as I said, was the information suppressed, kept secret, efforts, including efforts to avoid holding anyone accountable, in your telling.
Yes, when I began the book, I had a very difficult time telling this history because it turns out that the state of New York has largely shut down access to all of the records related to Attica. And that is in no small part because all of the deaths that happened on the 13th of September 1971, the day the state retakes the prison, are as a result of law enforcement bullets. None of those people...
Friendly fire, in other words.
Well, indeed. I mean, they are coming in, they are shooting thousands and thousands of bullets into this prison, and the carnage is prisoners, hostages die. And so the records thereafter are very controversial and they get shut down. And ultimately, no member of law enforcement is indicted for what happens during this retaking, even though all of the deaths during the retaking were at the hands of law enforcement.
So once the negotiations started, the inmates created a manifesto with a list of demands, 27 different demands. These are a few of the words that they said as kind of a prelude to the manifesto. You know, it was a situation that was very similar to many other places where people just felt that as a person who's been held in a correctional facility, that they are being treated as beasts. They are being treated as less than humans, and they simply wanted to be treated like human beings, and so they expressed this by basically trying to get the word out to the community outside of the prison that these are the things that we're dealing with, and we need your help to change the system. And so these are a few of the things that they said, and I found it very interesting once I looked at the list of things. There's 27 of them. I want to show you just a few of those real quickly. A few of the things that they talked about. They want legal representation at parole board hearings. They wanted a change in the medical staff and medical policy. They felt that the medical treatment was poor within the system. Adequate visiting conditions, facilities for inmates and families. Into segregation of prisoners from mainline population because of political beliefs. Into persecution and punishment of prisoners who practice peaceful dissent. And into political persecution, racial persecution, denying of prisoners' rights to subscribe to political papers, books, and other educational material. Industries, they wanted to be allowed into the prisons so that they could offer them real jobs. So not just come in and make money off of these people and not pay them anything. They wanted industry to come into the prisons, offer them jobs, give them training so that they would have skills once they got out. That was one of the demands that they had way back then. That inmates be granted the right to join and form labor unions. That correctional officers be prosecuted as a matter of law for any act of cruel or unusual punishment. And also that institutions using inmate labor be made to conform to state and federal minimum wage laws. And then lastly, the establishment of inmate workers insurance plan to provide compensation for work-related accidents. So they basically wanted the same thing that people outside the prison have, the same types of rights. That's just a small list of some of the demands they had. So let's look at a few others. There were some other rebellions that took place, including women's prisons. This one is called the August Rebellion, happened in upstate New York in August of 1974. And the prisoners basically were upset because one of their leaders was treated very badly after she filed a lawsuit demanding that certain things change, especially the policy with solitary confinement. And the judge who heard the case agreed with her and sided with her in his ruling. And then prison guards reciprocated by beating her, putting her in a segregated cell, leading to the uprising. So fortunately, the uprising was actually successful because it did lead to some reforms afterwards. So, sometimes these things happen and it may not look like it's successful, at the moment, but later down the line, we'll see some changes being made. And this led to some major changes within women's prisons, not just in New York, but it also impacted women's prisons around the country. Another one, which happened in the women's correctional facility in 1975, was a sit-in strike against conditions at the only prison laundry facility. It was a nonviolent protest, and even though they were nonviolent, when the guards finally came in, the guards were not nonviolent. They were very brutal in beating them down. So it kind of showed that they tell us that if we protest to be nonviolent, but just because you're nonviolently protesting doesn't mean that the reaction will be nonviolent as well. New Mexico State Penitentiary uprising back in 1980 was a very bloody event. 33 inmates died, more than 200 were treated for injuries. There had been an organized strike there in 1976 because of the deputy warden was really not a very nice person. So they had this organized strike for people who were working there, and he responded by using tear gas and made them run the length of the prison dormitory to isolation and segregation cells. And then along the main hallways, corrections officers lined up with batons and even axes and basically hit the inmates as they were passing by. So very brutal response to a nonviolent prison strike. Overcrowding and inferior services were the main causes of the event. And plus, as you see, there were 1,156 inmates in the prison designed to hold 900. It did lead to reforms in New Mexico that are still currently in effect to this day. So once again, successful in, even though it took a number of years for those reforms to kind of kick in. The Atlanta prison uprising is one that happened in federal prisons as a result of Cubans who had been basically incarcerated. And these were people who had left Cuba after Fidel Castro basically said, you know, if you want to leave, you can leave. These are people who left in this boat lift to come to the U.S. and were arrested and never charged with anything. Never charged. And many of them are still in prison to this day. You know, we don't know that we have people in prison who are simply in prison who've never been charged with a crime. These are simply people that the U.S. didn't want on the streets. They threw them in prison. They got word that they were going to be sent back to Cuba because of this negotiation between the U.S. government and the Cuban government. So they had an uprising there, which lasted 11 days. And it led, once again, to a great deal of violence. They burned down over $1 million worth of government owned material. And then they won the battle by getting representation at parole hearings, as well as having people hear their stories for the first time. Because prior to this, nobody really knew that we had all of these prisoners locked up simply because they had come over on a boat lift and never committed a crime. We just threw them in prison and held them without any charges. So, a week ago, actually a month ago, I was doing some research for a presentation that I plan to do sometime in the future on the history of mass incarceration. So I was doing some research on a company, one of the largest private prison companies in the country. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Geo Group before. A company called CoreCivic. CoreCivic used to be known as Corrections Corporation of America. They changed the name 2 years ago. It sounds quite lovely now, you know. It's a beautiful name, it's just a company. And so I was doing some research on these companies, and I ran across a notice that they were sponsors of the 148th Annual American Corrections Association National Conference. And it was going to be held in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I'm like, I told my wife, I think I want to go to this. And she's like, why? And I said, because I'm doing this research and I'm trying to inform people and educate people about, you know, not just the prison system, but all of these tentacles that are reaching into corrections from all of these different angles, all of these companies that are doing business with corrections that are making millions and even billions of dollars. I said, nobody knows who they are. So when I went to the website for the conference, they had a list of 20 sponsors. Of those 20 sponsors, I only heard of 3 of the companies before. So I said, I have to go. So I went to the website and I signed up for the conference. And I told my wife, I'm going to go. And she's like, well, have fun being a spy. I said, yeah, I'll be a spy. So I went to the conference. It was last weekend. I drove to Minneapolis last week, Friday night. I went to the conference both Saturday and Sunday. So when I went there, the first thing I saw was this sign, welcome to American Correctional Association's 148th Congress of Correction. Woohoo! So I'm like, great. So I went to a couple workshops that first day, and then the following day they opened up this huge hall where they had all of these vendors there. So you had, CoreCivic there, you had Geo Group there, you had Aramark there, you had all of these companies that do all of these variety of types of businesses with the prison system. And this was the main reason I went. I wanted to go and see who these companies were and what type of business they were doing. And I went into this hall and I was shocked at the number of vendors, number one, but I was even more shocked by the number of companies that were doing things that I never even thought about before. So there were companies there that were selling their wares for flooring in prisons and jails. This is what they do. They provide special coating for floors in prisons and jails. You had companies there that were providing medical and dental care. You had companies there who were providing telephone service. And one of the biggest, actually the biggest, is a company called Securus. Anybody ever heard of Securus before? They one of the branches, and it became a branch because they bought this other company out, JPay. Yeah. Anybody ever heard of JPay? So when you go to prisons, the phone systems use this thing called JPEG. They are the ones who own JPEG now. They had this big, beautiful exhibit. I mean, with all this, I mean, it was just phenomenal, just beautiful. Horrible, but beautiful at the same time. And what I discovered about them was something that kind of really awakened to me exactly who and what they were. Because earlier that day, on Sunday, before I went and saw all of these exhibitors, I had the opportunity to go and visit a prison. So they offered an opportunity to go to the county jail, to go to a women's prison, or a men's prison. So I chose to go on a tour of a men's prison, which is about 35, 40 minutes north of Minneapolis, medium security prison. And I went and got the tour, and it was a fascinating journey. They showed us everything. We didn't miss any part of the prison. We got to walk through the cell blocks and kind of talk to some of the people who were incarcerated. We got to go inside a couple of people's cells. We got to meet corrections officers, talk to them. We got to talk to some guys who were part of a program where they actually trained service dogs for visually impaired people. There were a group of 6 inmates who did that. We were able to talk to them and learn about how that was impacting them. We walked out into the yard where they were exercising. We went into the chow hall. I mean, we saw everything. And one of the things that I saw was it didn't register so much to me at the moment, but later that night when I went to the exhibit hall, it registered to me. I saw Secure's JPEG tablet and telephone system here. So when I came back, I did a little more research on Securus, and I found out that it's a huge company. They made last year, according to their financial records, about $600 million in revenue generated. 70% of that revenue was generated from telephone calls made in jails and prisons around the United States of America. So they're making a ridiculous amount of money. And I just want to show you how impactful this trip was, because what I did was I brought bags back with me. I want to show you something. These are bags with brochures from all of the vendors that we have at the conference. They're very heavy. I plan to use these as part of my research for my mass incarceration talk.
No, I think you might be better understood if you don't use that.
Yeah, I think so too.
Oh, okay.
There's a speed pass effect.
Oh, I didn't. So, I went to the conference. My aim was to learn about all of these different companies, and that's exactly what I did. I was able to talk to a lot of the people, kind of put a human face on them. And so, what it's going to allow me to do is to learn about all these different companies. This is a list of all of the vendors that were there. You can see it's an exhaustive list. And most of these companies are companies I've never heard of before, didn't know anything about who they were, what they did, but this is all of the vendors that were there. So I went through the exhibit hall, and I was about halfway through, and they turned off the lights. I'm like, what? It's only from 4 to 6. I didn't realize I had spent 2 hours walking around, talking to people, getting brochures, and I had only got to do half of the hall. So I spent the last 15 minutes clandestinely running around. the people who were there to clean the space has got this big, huge carpet cleaning machine. Was driving around, wondering why I'm still in the room. But I wanted to get brochures from everybody, so I did that. And part of the reason I did is because of this. I'm working on a series of presentations. I don't have a date when I'm going to do them. I was hoping to do them before the end of this year. It'll probably be sometime in early next year. A series of presentations I call the 2.2 million, looking at the history of mass incarceration and how we've created the system that we have. And what I really want to do is to show people that mass incarceration and the level of incarceration we have is not directly related to just the war on drugs. What we miss, one of the arguments I make is that you can't fight a war on drugs without building an army first. So I'm going to show us how we built this army that allows us to incarcerate over 2 million people, how that all developed. Look at the role that John Kennedy played in it, that Lyndon Johnson played in it, because they're always left out of the conversation. And Lyndon Johnson, I believe, played a bigger role than any other president. And I'll share that during this presentation, or series of presentations. So look at racism's page. Once I do schedule these, it'll be posted on their calendar. It'll also be on the website for America's Black Holocaust Museum. It'll be on a Facebook page. It'll be on my personal Facebook page. It'll be on a Facebook page for my company, Nurturing Diversity Partners. It'll be on the Facebook page for Red Racism. You know, everybody that I'm attached to. I'm looking forward to this because I think there's a lot of information so far. I've been doing research on this since probably around January when I started. And I still have a long way to go. There's still a significant amount of stuff that I want to still continue to dig into and share. And I'm hoping that when I do this presentation, people have a much more well-rounded understanding of how the system works, because I believe that all of us have a misconception because of one major thing: television and movies. Cop shows, crime shows, shows about prisons, they're all getting it wrong. How many of you guys ever watched Law and Order? One version of it. There's like 7 different versions. I used to love Law and Order. And every other episode of Law and Order, they have somebody in the box, right? And they're threatening them. If you don't contest, we're going to stick a needle in your arm, right? So these people are threatened with the death penalty every other episode. So I'm doing some research on the death penalty, right? And I discovered the state of New York has not executed a single person since 1963. I'm like, Law and Order, you've been lying to me all this time. Why are you lying? I could never watch Law and Order again after that. So I want people to get to the same place that I'm going, learning more about the reality of the system, because you can't reform the system unless you know how it works. So thank you all so much. So I know we had just a little time left in this for Q&A, so I'll take a few questions. Anyone have any questions? Anyone? Yes?
Is any of that in paper? I mean, it was really hard to
Yeah.
take in any of
I can provide it. I mean, I can provide the entire thing.
something online.
So you can get my business card from it, and then I can send you a PDF version of it.
Okay.
Because I know it's hard to see. Part of it, you know, like the manifesto and things of that nature, it was so long I didn't want to have like 10 slides.
Yeah.
So you can see it better, just for the sake of time. But I'll certainly provide the entire presentation to anyone who wants it by email if you choose. Anyone else? Yes.
It seems like they're covering business of prisons. While that's so related to small and large and all different kinds of businesses, they need the prisons to keep going. So that's why we have prisons.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that's happened as a result of deindustrialization around the country, we've lost factories throughout the country. And in many of these communities, small rural communities that may have had a factory, when those factories went away, that was the main employer in town. So it used to be this policy in these rural communities, particularly, they call it NIMBY, not in my backyard. But after the factories closed up, they started to battle to see who could get a prison built. The state of Wisconsin has built 21 correctional institutions since I graduated from high school in 1983. And most of them have been in rural communities around the state. So what we've done is, we think of mass incarceration, we think of the 2.2 million people we have incarcerated in prisons and jails, but what we don't recognize are all the other pieces that are connected to it. All of the additional police officers we hired, all the additional district attorneys, public defenders, investigators for district attorneys, judges, court clerks, corrections guards, people who provide all of these different things within the prison system, companies that provide the food, companies that provide the laundry service, companies that provide the metal detectors within it. I mean, there's so many businesses that are directly related to corrections that it's really unfathomable when you really think about it, because we simply think about the people behind bars, but we don't think about the fact that there are literally millions of people who are employed as a result of us having 2.2 million people incarcerated. And part of what I'll be sharing during the presentation is the growth of people related to corrections. So I'll show you the growth over the course of time, and the number of police officers we have nationwide, on the state level as well as the federal level, the number of people who are in the court system. So judges, law clerks, all of these different people, as well as the number of police officers. I think it's going to really blow people away because we never really think about all of those pieces that are connected that are employing people.
You talked about the presidents and the kinds of influence they had in terms of mass incarceration. The role of the governor, could you say a little bit more about that?
Our current governor?
If you like, or just in terms of the state.
Yeah, I think so. When we look at Wisconsin prisons, there are two things that stand out about Wisconsin's prison system. One is the fact that we got rid of parole in 1999, right? We have a parole commission. It's 7 seats on it, but only, I think the last time I checked, there were only 3 seats that were filled, right?
That's true.
We've gone from, before the current governor became governor, we had a significant number of people who received parole each year. You know, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12 or 1,300 people on average each year. We've dropped to less than 50 over the last 2 years. So you have this huge drop in people who got parole. So that's one thing. We have what we call the old law versus the new law. We have about 3,000 people incarcerated in Wisconsin who are under the old law, under the parole system. So when they were sentenced, they were given in their paperwork a mandatory release date, which mandatory doesn't mean mandatory. It means whenever the heck they want to let you out, because the mandatory release date means that the parole commission will have to release you on a certain date. But guess what? If you can't even get in front of the parole commission, what good does it do? You're not going to get out. So we have 3,000 people that are rotting, and they're not going to get out unless we have a change in that policy. The other thing that I think that stands out as directly related to Governor Walker, and he was the one that pushed this truth in sentencing, in Wisconsin. That was how he made his name politically, was pushing this truth in sentencing, getting rid of parole back in the day. So that's how he became the person that he is. The other thing I mentioned earlier is revocations. Unless we reform the system of revocation, it's an issue because so many people go in, do the revocation, but another part of it is that we are the only state in the country where your supervised release, when you get out, say you have 3 years of supervised release, right? You get out and then somebody calls and says you did something and they send you back for a short period of time and then eventually get out again. Every other state, if you have 3 years, you get out for a year, you go back for 2 months, and then you just continue a year plus whatever. In Wisconsin, we don't do that. We start the clock over. Every time you get out, the clock starts. We're the only state that doesn't. So you have people that may have, say, 2 years of supervised release who may end up doing like 12 years of supervised release because the clock keeps starting over and over and over and over and over again. That's a significant reason that we have such a large, steady population within our prison system here in Wisconsin. And I think that it's not just the governor that we need to address this with. It's our state government, the legislature in Madison. Many of these policies that Governor Walker has been in support of have been put in place as a result of the people that we have in our state government. And it's unfortunate that we haven't made more progress, even though there's been significant effort on the parts of a lot of people to change these systems. We haven't made the type of progress that we need to make. There's still a lot of work to do. I think he was next, and then I'll come in. Yes, sir.
Two things. Two, I heard that the prison guard union and the police union is some of the largest lobbyists in the state of Wisconsin in particular, which of course adds to this dynamic as well.
Yeah.
And I wondered too, what your thoughts were on doing public pressure campaigns on these specific firms that are making money off of this, because it seems like something that we could tie into broad-based movement.
Yeah. Thank you. So his first question was about the role of the unions, the corrections officers unions. So, when we look at the system in different states, including in Wisconsin, one of the biggest proponents of maintaining status quo are the unions. Because guess what? We have all of these people who are employed. We want them to keep a job. So when I hear people say that we want to cut Wisconsin's prison population in half, that means we'll need a lot less prison guards than we currently have, right? So all these corrections officers are going to lose their jobs. You're not going to find many elected officials that are running a platform and getting rid of jobs, right? I mean, nobody's going to say, I'm going to get rid of half of the corrections officers in the state of Wisconsin. They may come out and say, I'm in support of cutting the prison population in half, but that means that you're going to get rid of half of the prison guards. So it's going to be a very difficult thing because they do a significant amount of lobbying. They have a significant amount of ability to put pressure to maintain the status quo. And then the second part he asked about was putting pressure on these companies that do business. I think that part of what I want to do by bringing all of those brochures back and using that as part of the presentation is to simply show people how massive it is. Because I had no idea. When I went to this conference, I'm thinking, maybe 25, 30 vendors. There were well over 100 vendors here in a variety of different areas. Some of them actually, I actually listened to what they were there for, and some of them were actually there for a good thing. Actually, the first person I talked to was a woman from a company who does drug treatment and correction facilities and raising awareness of the opioid crisis and how that's addressed and doing it the right way. So there are some companies that are doing it for the right reason, that are there to offer reentry services, but many of the companies are simply there to make money off of people who are incarcerated. And the largest growing part of our prison population are actually immigrant detainees. So the private prison industry is growing very rapidly because of people who are putting in these detention facilities. We're not calling them prisons, we're calling them detention facilities, but they're prisons that we're putting children in, and we're putting their parents in a separate prison somewhere else. So I think it's important to learn who these companies are, specifically the ones like CoreCivic, Geo Group, Securus, the ones that are making the most amount of money. Those are the ones that need to be exposed. And there have been lawsuits filed against Securus because of the J-Pay system and how much they're overcharging people. So there are efforts to kind of do something about it. But I think to answer your question, the best way is to raise awareness about who they are. Then you can say, okay, I know who the companies are, now I can figure out a way to address doing something about who they are. And it is possible to put pressure on them. Corrections Corporation of America wouldn't have changed their names unless there was pressure put on them because of the dirty business that they were doing. That's why they changed their names. They try to say they changed for number, but it's obvious why they changed it. So, thank you. Yes, and then I'll get to you next.
So there's a question about the role of the government. Maybe I don't know if you, in your research, encountered the situation when we had a government at Catalyst who was a Democrat, and the general philosophy of the state at that point was to de-emphasize prison. We just built a big prison, and we sold it to the federal government because we felt we didn't need it this time. When it asked about privilege. So I'm wondering if you either come across that or you have any sense of the shifting in philosophy for this.
Yeah, one of the things, when we're talking about incarceration, one thing we have to be very clear, it's not a Democratic or Republican issue. The number of people who've gone to prison nationwide, the largest growth in prisons happened when Bill Clinton was president of the United States. Now, it wasn't all his fault. A big part of it was his fault because of some laws that he was, a proponent of. But when we look at the issues, whether it be on the federal level or the state level, it's not one of these partisan issues. We have to understand that just because we have a Democrat in office doesn't mean anything. Just because we have a Republican in office doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be worse. It doesn't matter. Historically, if you look across the country, it hasn't mattered all that much whether you have Democrats or Republicans in office. And the primary reason for that is this idea of tough on crime. No one wants to run on a platform where they're not going to be tough on crime. So that's always going to be an impediment to putting pressure on elected officials because they don't want to show that they're soft on crime. So it doesn't matter if it's Patrick Lucy or Scott Walker, whomever. The issue will be a continuing issue regardless of who's in office. When I was in Minnesota, there was a workshop I went to, and they showed the prison population in Minnesota. Wisconsin and Indiana, the state populations are very similar, almost, just a few 100,000 different, right? So very close population. 3,000 people here, they incarcerate only about 10,000 in Minnesota. They have about 107,000 people who are on supervised release there. They actually, when you get revoked in Minnesota, the maximum amount of time you can do a revocation is 6 months. So we have, some things that we could learn from Minnesota. I went to a workshop where they do programming for people who are getting out of prison. So the last 3 days you're in prison in Minnesota, you go through a 3-day workshop where they give you advice on how to do interviews, how to do job searches. They have the DMV come in. Imagine this. The DMV comes in and gives people a state-issued ID card in the prison before they get out. They have the Social Security Administration come in and give people a Social Security card if they want to have one. They have the state come in and give people a birth certificate if they don't have. So they're really preparing people for the world outside of those doors. Whereas in Wisconsin, we're just like, see you when you come back. It's pretty much the policy we have. So I want to let Ben go ahead and get started. So I'm going to take one last question and then I'm going to hand it over to Ben.
My question was, with privatized prisons being on the rise, are you going to go into depth about the business with that as well as schools?
Yeah, so part of what I'll cover in the presentations is the rise of private prisons. I think that there's a great deal of misinformation about private prisons, though. Only about 13% of all of the 2.2 million, well, there's 1.7 million people in prisons. Only about 13% of the people who are in prisons are in private prisons. And most of the private prisons, CoreCivic and Geo Group are the two companies that have about 90% of the private prison business. Most of the private prisons are in about 5 states. So Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, I'm trying to remember the other state. There's like 5 or 6 states where most of the people in private prisons are. And the growth in private prisons has actually been in immigrant detainees. So that's where the growth is. So unless we address that particular issue, we're going to continue to see growth. But I think that most of us don't understand that we have, we have the federal prison system, we have the state prison system, and then we have county jails. Those are the 3 places that we incarcerate people. And most of the reform efforts have been dealing at the state level, which I think is a good thing. Because what I argue is that we don't have one criminal justice system. We literally have about 3,000. So we have about 3,000 counties in the United States of America. About 2,300 of those counties have their own district attorney. So if you want to make real reform happen, it has to happen at the front end before people go in. It's much harder to deal with it once people get out or once people get in. The reform that I would support, that I would say is most important, is preventing people from going there in the first place. And it starts with your local district attorneys. So thank you, Wilson.
Our other major speaker is Ben Turk. He describes himself as an abolitionist organizer. He's with Milwaukee IWOC, which is the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. He's also co-founder of the LucasvilleAmnesty.org. Lucasville, as perhaps you will share more, was prisoner resistance situation in Ohio. And the latest edition of the National Lawyers Guild practitioner has a major story co-authored by Scott Lynn, a lawyer and historian, some note on this situation and some of the recent documentations coming out. And he also works with Fire Inside Collective, which he described as a collective which collects and distributes reports inside. And he's an author, probably many other things, but I just happened to stagger over the table. Decarceration and reconfiguration of basic currency, he's co-authored this, it's on the table. So without further ado,
So yeah, like Art said, with the Fire and Psych Collective, and this is another thing we put together. This is mostly writings from prisoners, and it's Alan Schultz, which I think many people in the room know Alan, has described this as like the Bible of prison organizing. So that's what the Fire and Psych Collective does. Before we go further, I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank all the co-sponsors of events. Thank you, Reggie, for the excellent presentation. And I want to talk a little bit more about who I am. Like Art said, I am involved with the Lucasville Amnesty campaign. Back in 2011, 3 survivors of the Lucasville uprising went on a hunger strike in Ohio. And I was just had just moved to Ohio, and I went there and started visiting with them and corresponding with them. And those relationships changed my life and really made me invested in these issues. They've been in solitary confinement since 1993. They're still in solitary confinement now because this uprising happened, and they were actually the ones who negotiated the peaceful surrender of the uprising, but the state targeted them as leaders of the uprising. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The main reason that I was hoping to bring everybody here today is to talk about the upcoming strike on August 21st. There's been a call from the inside for prisoners all across the country to refuse to work and to engage in hunger strikes, sit-down strikes, boycotts the commissary, whatever tactics make sense where they're at, to put economic pressure on the system so that it stops running. This was set for August 21st, which is the anniversary of the assassination of George Jackson, which Reggie talked about, to September 9th, which is when the Attica started. Another project that I'm involved in that hasn't actually started yet is a timeline of prisoner resistance. And we have been collecting stories, everything that we can about incidents of prisoners taking collective action against the administration. We started with 2010 as the start-off point to the present, and we have found over 120 different examples of these incidents occurring. And we know there's at least a few dozen more that we know of that we haven't added to the archive yet, and untold many, many more, especially prior to 2016, we started really paying attention. So we know that there's a lot more going on the inside. And this also doesn't include like individual acts of resistance where a prisoner files a lawsuit or a grievance, or a prisoner just loses their patience and fights back against the administration. And so the takeaway that I have from working on this project is that resistance to prison is constant. As Reggie said, people have been fighting back against prisons since the first one was built, and they're fighting back against prisons every day. Right now, somewhere in this country, someone is fighting against prison, and that means that that repression and retaliation is constant. The guards are always pushing back, and always fighting, and always inflicting violence on people. And so what that leaves me with is the understanding that humanity hates a cage. When you put someone in a cage, they're going to try to get out of that cage. And we live in a society that is so heavily dependent on prison, and we're going to continue to pay these costs as long as we continue to let that dependency exist in our society. So that's just what we need to kind of be aware of continuously. But I want to look at some highlights from this archive. There's 6 things that I want to look at in greater detail. It's a whole lot of information. I'm going to try to get it all said so we have time for question and answer. Some of this content is going to describe violence and things that happen on the inside that are hard to hear about. So I just want everyone to be prepared and aware that be warned if there's some hard things that we talk about. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is the Georgia prison strikes. In December of 2010, this is the largest prison strike in history prior to this. More than 6 facilities participated. That's thousands of prisoners who refused to work, and that's a crisis for the prison system. When prisoners aren't working, the prisons can't run. So the prisons depend on the labor of the people on the inside. It was started off by a diverse group of leaders, so white guys, black guys, brown guys, everybody working together, communicating with each other, and kind of coordinating to pull this off. Their demands were really basic stuff, very similar to the demands that Reggie put up on here. Wages, education, healthcare, end of cruel punishments, improved living conditions, adequate meals, all the really basic stuff. And the Georgia DOC responded by saying that this was, that they heard rumors of a riot, and that's why they locked the facilities down. And the prisoner said, no, you didn't lock us down, we locked ourselves down. This is our action, we did this. This is a sit-down strike, not a riot that you're trying to control. Other responses from the DOC was inmate or staff attacked prisoners. Kelvin Stevenson and Miguel Jackson were beaten and taken off block, and other people who witnessed this said that they looked like they were dead. Their family was not informed for days about their whereabouts or what had happened. Days later, they were found they were in a hospital and they had survived. Outside support for this was really important. Bruce Dixon at the Black Agenda Report, who's a journalist reporter, broke the story and really kept pushing it and did a lot of the awareness so that we knew what was actually going on as this was happening. Elaine Brown, who's a former chairperson of the Black Panther Party, Pastor Kenny Glasgow from the Ordinary People's Society, the Green Party, and other groups on the outside came together to work on this. The biggest success that they had was they filed a lawsuit and they finally got the state to actually admit to what happened to Kelvin and Miguel. And this is the part where there's going to be some I just want to show some of these pictures because it's important to the prisoners, so if you don't want to look, don't look. But they released a video, and in the video, it showed correctional officers beating them with hammers, and they were beaten mercilessly. And it's really hard to tell on the video, but there's actually a person holding a camera. He says, what is that? That's a hammer from the gun. And that was the slow motion version.
Oh.
So they sued the DOC. That's Kelvin Stevenson, and Miguel is further down. The long-term effect of this prison strike was that Georgia changed and rearranged how they did their business. They instituted a tier system where they could isolate the leaders and keep them from being coordinated and organized strikes like this again. There's been a lot of prison resistance since 2010, and Georgia has not been a part of it because that system has worked to prevent them from being organized. Miguel and Kelvin and other leaders are still in solitary now. They've staged multiple hunger strikes from inside solitary against that tier system, and they haven't been able to win it. But the good thing that came out of the strike is that it inspired lots of other people. I got involved in this because a month after this happened, those prisoners from the Lucasville Uprising, Jason Robb, C. Gudula Hassan, Lamani Shakur, went on a hunger strike, and they lasted 13 days and they won. So the combination of this terrible thing that happened and them winning that hunger strike has been an inspiration to many prisoners across the country. Later that year, in the summer, we got to the second example I want to go to, which is the California hunger strikes. That started with the Short Corridor Collective in the Pelican Bay Secure Housing Unit. These are people who are, again, in solitary confinement. One of them had been in solitary for 40 years. Protesting. They get together, and these are people who are kind of labeled the worst of the worst. They're the gang leaders in California, and in California, is very much run by the gangs. There's different racial factions and gangs, and they came across those differences to work together, just like in Georgia, just like in the and they organized a hunger strike. In July of 2011, 6,000 people participated in that hunger strike. It was a rolling hunger strike, so people could go on for a week and then come off and participate in that way. Other people started the hunger strike on the 4th of July and stayed on through the duration. California promised to make all these changes, and so they suspended the hunger strike to see if California would go through and make those changes, which they didn't. So they had to go back on hunger strike again. And it took a few years of playing that kind of cat and mouse game with the administrations. But in 2013, they went back on hunger strike in earnest again in July, and this time 30,000 prisoners participated. The largest protesting set prisons in history of that time. 2000 also engaged in a work stoppage, which, like in Georgia, really shuts the prisons down. This caused spin-off hunger strikes in other states. Lots of people were participating all over the place. Their focus and demands were on solitary confinement, changing the conditions, ending long-term or indefinite solitary confinement, and the gang classification system. It's really convoluted, but the things that they could do to prisoners if they, had any suspicion that you were involved in a gang is just horrible. And another really great thing that came out of the California hunger strike is an agreement to end hostilities. Like I said, these are different rival factions who were organizing and coordinating this. So they wrote out the agreement to end hostilities, which called for truce among prisoners, which lasted for years, and also was picked up by youth on the street. And so this is a way in which we, saw people stopping fighting amongst each other and instead fighting for their liberation. In response, the CDCR did, like I said, delays, false promises, and did everything they could to kind of hold things up. And they also harassed and targeted people. Hunger strikers were treated incredibly poorly. One hunger striker, Billy Guerrero Cell, died while on hunger strike, and it was ruled a suicide, but the prisoners refuted that. They said if it was a suicide, it was because he was driven to it by the way the guards were treated. After 42 days on hunger strike, California got a judge to sign an order saying that they can start force feeding people. And that's when they ended the hunger strike and instead focused on a lawsuit. This force feeding is excruciatingly painful, it's really difficult, and it's really dangerous. So the risk to someone's life is force fed. While they were working on the lawsuit, the guards started a new project where they would do wellness checks on prisoners. They would go through the block every 30 minutes. So they open those loud steel doors, walk through the block, shine lights on people, talking, making all this noise every 30 minutes. And they would do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for a long summer, so nobody can sleep. The support for the California hunger strike was massive. It was mostly based out of the Bay, where there's a culture of resistance and a culture of support for people who are fighting back and acceptance of all different kinds of people. So it was led by the prisoners. All the documents that came out were signed by the Schroeder collected and other prisoners, and their families were also really central to all of the organizing. And there was enough support for those family members to actually be effective and able to put out lots of videos and organize lots of protests. Ed Mead, who was part of the George Jackson Brigade and did some time as well while back in prison back in the 70s and 80s, was also part of the outside support. He wrote a newsletter called The Rock, which was really useful for the prisoners to coordinate and plan their actions. And eventually the prisoners convinced the Center for Constitutional Rights to file a lawsuit, and that lawsuit won. And the CDCR was forced to release thousands of prisoners from solitary confinement. So it was a huge, amazing victory. But like every victory, we need to protect it. Victoria Law was another abolitionist and a really great thinker, who some people know. She wrote a really great article in Solitary Watch about how those prisoner leaders are all back in solitary after only 15 months, and hundreds of others on a new pretense. They got rid of the gang classification system. They just came up with another system to put people in long-term solitary. And another tragic thing is that the agreement to end hostilities ended. It was undermined when guards worked with the Aryan Brotherhood to put a hit on and kill Hugo Cannell, who was a comment of George Jackson back in the day. That happened on August 12th of 2015, so 3 years ago today. That's in part of it. Which brings us to the next thing I want to look at. The third event is the Free Alabama movement. This is when prisoners, Melvin Murray, Kinetic Justice, and Dati Khalid, who were inspired and mentored by Black Panthers like Sekou Kambui and other prisoners from the old struggles, started organizing in Alabama prisons. They did a number of hunger strikes and food protests, and then they staged a work stoppage in January of 2014, where they shut down 2 facilities, and they lasted for over 2 weeks on that work stoppage, which is a huge problem for the prisons. When they did that, they also released dozens of videos to a YouTube channel showing the conditions in the prisons, showing the kind of food that they're eating, showing the roaches and the rats and the way that they're treated and everything like that. And this, by being their own media, using contraband cell phones, they really galvanized a lot of attention and had a very successful action. Then it broke up, and then in April they called for another one. This time, the first time they surprised everybody by doing it. This time they announced it in advance, hoping that they would get other facilities to participate and hoping that outside support would be able to be there for them so that, everyone's not scrambling. And instead, the prison responded and took all the solitary confinement. Some of them are still in solitary confinement now, but they kept organizing from the solitary. Their demands, more than any other prison group, they're really focused on slavery and on the recognition that they are not paid to work, that they're forced to work, and that in Alabama, which is former slave state, they are, it's the same situation. They wrote a really smart strategic document called Let the Cops Rock in the Fields, which is available over here if you want to pick one up. And their demands, they actually issued as a piece of legislation that they called the Freedom Bill. They got outside supporters to take this and try to get legislators to actually introduce it to the state assembly. It's calling for a lot of the same things: improved conditions, education, rehabilitation opportunities, and ending the really long draconian sentences. In response, Alabama Department of Corrections, well, when prisoners go on strike, especially if they sustain it for a long time, the guards have to then work, and the guards have to do all the things that they normally prisoners would do. So the already unsanitary conditions became totally abysmal, and food service dropped to almost nothing. They called it bird feeding because they're feeding people a fraction of what you actually need to clean this as well. There were also harassment and beatings of guards, and all of this pressure put enough divisions that they caused them to call off that first strike rather than having prisoners under all that stress start fighting with each other. And then they used preemptive lockdowns to prevent them from going on to the second strike they tried in April. And the outside support for this was run by the Mothers and Families. So it's Free Alabama Movement, FAM, and then Mothers and Families, MAF. It's the outside group. And so they did demos and a lot of outreach and support. They helped run these websites where the prisoners are able to be their own media because they put their stuff out through company phone and then it goes up on websites. It was also, this is what inspired the IWW to create the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. When Lorenzo Cambola Urban, another Black Panther who did a bunch of time in the spring during the Comatopco days, came to the IWW and was like, hey, these prisoners are doing labor organizing on the inside. You all are a union. You should work with them. And some former incarcerated people in the IWW were like, hell yeah, let's do it. And I wanted to form. So that brings us to the nationally coordinated strike on September 9th of 2016, which is something that I was really heavily involved in. This is the call to action for that strike. And